Something that's interesting about businesses is they're very predictable. They all go through a life cycle, and that life cycle is based on two factors: the rate of growth and the length of time. So if we plot that out on a graph where time is the horizontal axis and growth is the vertical axis, and we start from the very beginning, we'll see that there's been no time and no growth. That's called an idea. That's the seed of a business. An entrepreneur has an idea. That seed eventually becomes a sprout. And that sprout in business is nothing more than a proof of concept that the entrepreneur is trying to make happen. Now, as that seed grows into the seedling and then eventually into a sapling, it's kind of young and scrappy. And the entrepreneur now has passed that proof of concept. He's been able to get some investors, maybe his family and friends. He's hired an employee or two to help him sell his idea. It's a very dynamic business environment. It's very flexible. We're chasing any kind of revenue that we can get just to pay off the month's credit cards. In those stages, those early stages, we also see a philosophy that's very common, and we call that a family first business philosophy. But as the business grows and it begins to take on more girth, more structure, that sapling is now a young tree. It's getting closer to reaching, hopefully, its prime. Well, that prime is critically important in many ways. The first is the business philosophy, that if that philosophy can actually transition over to a business first family philosophy, in other words, putting the needs of the business ahead of the family's wants. That's a critical shift. If that happens, then the likelihood of the business continuing to stay in what we call the prosperity zone, or it's in its prime condition. We define that where flexibility is in balance with structure. You've put just enough structure in place to allow it to continue to grow, to innovate, but you don't allow the innovation and the growth to overshadow the structure, and you don't let the structure take precedent over the innovation and flexibility. You keep that in balance with a philosophy of putting the priorities and the needs of the business ahead of the family, then the business takes care of the family and the family takes care of the business. That is how we define the prosperity zone. And what I want you to notice on this graph that we're plotting out is prime is not at the peak. It's right before the peak. Why do you suppose we plot it there? Well, the reason is because once the business gets to the peak, imagine now 50 or 60-year-old oak tree, maybe a 100-year-old oak tree. It's at the very peak of its performance. It looks really good. It's full, it's healthy, and we see that in businesses. They become so healthy and so proud of themselves that they've reached the peak of their performance, that they don't innovate. They don't embrace change. They begin to rest on their laurels of what was in the past will get them to their future. So that's the difference between a middle-aged company at its peak versus a company that's prime, scrappy with structure. And you see those companies in prime reinvent themselves, and then they can elongate that life cycle. Those companies that don't, they become bureaucratic, they become slow to innovate, and they become resistant to change. And then they start slipping on the downhill side of the curve. And that curve can be fast and it can be slippery. You become a more senior company, like a tree. A tree becomes engulfed with some disease, and the disease and the insects start attacking that tree. Same thing in a business. The business becomes too bureaucratic. We don't want change. A lot of times we'll see recrimination, looking for who do we shoot? Who do we blame for that particular issue? Okay, instead of trying to solve the problem, instead of focusing in on the processes, they focus in on trying to lay blame on somebody or some strategy. And then it just deteriorates down and you can never get out of it. And you start losing cash and you start dropping leaves on the tree. Your tree eventually dies, and so does the company. So again, the life cycle of a business is known, it's understood, it's predictable, but what's not known and what's not understood is how to keep your business in the zone of prosperity and keeping it prime by making sure that you put the business needs ahead of your family's wants by being a business first family. That sets the direction, and then building the appropriate structure and letting that structure change and scale with you as that business scales.